Welcome grade 12s to Dandelion Delphi tutorials. Today we're going to look at the final of 2021, question 4, and it contains two-dimensional arrays. This question often contains some information in the scenario. Not that there's much here for us today, but in other questions, please make sure that you read the scenario. They explained to us that this program is going to be based on hikers that have a chart and are planning their hike trip from one checkpoint to the other, and that their overnight location must be determined by using code. We can then also expect an example of our GUI. So this is what it looks like, and there's the map. We're not actually going to do anything with that. That was just to make it look pretty. What is interesting about this paper is actually based on a real hiking trail. It is called the Strandloper, Afrikaans strand for beach, and loper for someone who is walking. And Morgan Bay is one of the points where you can stop. So if you're interested in starting to hike, this is actually a wonderful one. I've done it before because you don't have to carry all your food. It's planned in such a way that you can actually have lunch breaks at a little town. So you can have your lunch there and then just pack light food for the evening. So maybe if you're interested, this would be a good place to start. The paper will then explain to you what was provided. So there's names of the checkpoints in a one-dimensional array, 1 to 5 of a string data type. These are the values that's assigned to it. And then the distances between the checkpoints for the trails in a two-dimensional array. And there's also 1 to 5 rows and 1 to 5 columns. This being the first row with its 5 columns and the second row with its 5 columns, and so on. It is important that before you start programming, press F12 and just browse to the top to see what has been provided. There's a global string variable, there's an array, the one that was described, and the distances as well. Just to be sure that you know what is available to you to use, because those are often little tips as to what to use. What is further interesting about this paper is that we haven't seen two-dimensional arrays. This is now the paper of 2021 since the final of 2017. So they didn't ask 2D arrays for a while. There was one supplementary that they asked a 2D array. So this is the first chance with a more recent paper to practice two-dimensional arrays with. In the first button, they are asking us to write code to display the names of the checkpoints from the array names. That's your one-dimensional array. You can see them down here. And then the contents of the two-dimensional array, that's the array distance in neat columns in the rich edit. We also have a note here to say the intersections between two of the same points has a value of 0. What that means is that in this grid, you will see if you want to travel from Morgan, which is actually Morgan Bay in the hiking trail, but if you want to travel from Morgan to Morgan, it would be 0. Haga Haga to Haga Haga is 0, and so on. They gave you a little tip here to say that the tabs, that means your #9s and the blank lines, like these ones here and maybe those ones there, in the example of output are included for readability, but not required for your program to output this. This really just means there's no marks allocated for it. So you don't have to spend time on making it look exactly like this, as long as your rows and columns correspond with the output. Once you start this question, you will see that in this button, some of the code was provided. There was a reachEdit.lines.add with the S heading that was displayed. So if you have a look, it was declared as global, but if you go to form activate, You would also see here that the tab stops was set for you and that the heading S heading contains the headings. Now those headings are displayed and that's these ones there. You don't have to do that. Your job is to display this part here. Press pause and try it yourself. This is the provided code. That's S headings and an empty line that they provided for you. And you then continue below that line with your own code. Our two-dimensional array had 5 rows and 5 columns. So I'm going to start with iRow, which remember when you have a for loop, these variables for the for loop, in this example, iRow and iCol, those would be local variables and not global. Our for loop variables should always be local variables because we only need to use them in this button. If you go back to my previous videos where I explained two-dimensional arrays, you will remember that I said when you have a row question, start with your for loop for the row. Now, when we're displaying in a rich edit, we are displaying row by row. And for that reason, I'm starting with a for loop for the row. I'm looping through all the rows, and I need to build a string. Now the first part, if we go back to the output, the first part here of every line, I'm going to build and display one line at a time. The first part there is my one-dimensional array. So I'm initializing my output string, I just use S-line, as the name from array names, the one-dimensional array that was provided, making use of my row counter. So the first time that this loop executes, it will make use of Morgan. I've added my #9, but there were no marks allocated for the #9 as the question indicated. Then you have to loop through the for loop for the columns from 1 to 5. We had 5 columns in the 2D array and build the string. So the string is on both sides of the assignment statement. Take Morgan and add to it the first distance. So the first time this loop executes, our row would be 1, our call would be 1, and a #9. And it loops again. Our row will still be 1, because remember we're on the inside of this for loop, but the column will change to column 2. And so it will loop through all 5 columns and add that distance to my string. I want to keep it as a string because I want to display it in my rich edit. And you need to make use of floater string. You can also make use of floater string F. The reason I used floater string in here is because the values were hard-coded. So we know the values will be displayed with a number of decimals that is stored in there. Once this for loop executed, so all the way from 1 to 5, S-line will have the value of the first line, and I display S-line. There was an empty line there, but remember the question said it wasn't important. And then it would loop to the second row and start with the name of array names 2 as the next line that we want to display. So array name 2 would be Haga Haga. If you look at your output, we have displayed that now. Now we're going to display this line here, and under the for loop for the row, I'm storing Haga Haga from my one-dimensional array in S-line. Let's go back there, and then build a string with a 2D array and display. I have added here how we allocated marks while we were marking this question. You get 1 mark for the for loop for the row and 1 mark for the for loop for the column. To initialize S-line with a one-dimensional array, 1 mark. You didn't need the #9 in this exam to score the mark. In other exams, that might be required. Then you had to build your string with your two-dimensional array. 1 mark. Remember your array, row first, column second. And then you had to display your string that you've built. So S line is my output string, and displaying that in my rich edit is worth 1 mark. This is code that you can study, as the code to display in the rich edit doesn't change. However, if you are struggling in an exam with this, or you can't remember it, as it happens in exams, make sure that you have your for loops. So just having the 2 for loops, 1 mark each, and having an output string, 1 mark, even though it doesn't work. Also remember that we will mark code that is commented out. So let's say this line here gave you an error. Don't delete it. Put comments around it. We will still mark it unless you have a second line here trying to do the same thing. Then we're not going to look at the commented code. I know you are dreading that question 4, but you must remember every question has some easy marks. If we look at question 4.1, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 marks for which you can study. The code to output in your rich edit doesn't change. Just try the best you can and don't leave out the whole question. These type of charts are often found in places like the Kruger National Park in South Africa, as well as when we're doing hiking trails and we have options to go to different places. Just to explain to you how these work, the chart indicates here if I want to go from Haga Haga to Morganby, that there, 6.2, is the distance. In other words, if I want to go from Morgan to Haga Haga, that should be the same because it's the same 2 towns, so the distance there should be the same. What the next question is explaining is that there were some errors and that numbers were rounded down where there were decimal places and they were incorrect and needed to be replaced. If you have a look at traveling from Morgan Bay to Sinsa, that's 9.57 if I read it this way. However, if I go from Sinsa to Morgan Bay, now it's just 9. Now this integer value there, which is always lower than the correct value, that is the incorrect one and needs to be replaced. So you need to check where the rows and columns are corresponding, that you have the correct values stored in there. So Sinsa to Haga Haga, 13.37. And if I look at Sinsa from here to Haga Haga, that value there must be the same. Should they be different, I must replace the integer with the real value. So let's quickly have a look at the wording. I just wanted to show you that. Some of the values were correct, incorrect, and the values were rounded down. The inaccurate integer values needed to be replaced by the more accurate decimal values. Write code to do the following. Check if the corresponding row and column in the array distance are exactly the same, as I showed you guys in the picture just now. For example, the value of array distance 1 and 3 and 1 must be the same. 4 and 2 and 4 must be the same. For each inaccurate value that is identified, we need to replace the integer value with a correct decimal value. Then we had to display the position of the inaccurate values that were identified as a row and column number. So we had to say, if I found there was an error in row 2 and 4, we had to display row 2, row 4, and the accurate value, so the decimal value had to be displayed. Press pause, give it a try. I'll show you some examples of output and then the memo. First, test your program before you watch the memo. You want to try and get it correct yourself, and only when you're desperate, you want to watch the memo. Here is your example of output 1 and 3. That was that Sinsa value that we wanted to replace. And then row 5, Gnubi, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Gnubi and Beacon. That one had to be replaced. Those had to be correct, and then with your correct values, the decimal values, and there is an example of your output once it's been updated in the two-dimensional array. This is the provided code, so they did give you the heading there and a dot clear. And here we go for question 4.2. So we're going to loop through all the rows and columns. Doesn't really matter which one you start with, but if it doesn't matter which one I need to start with, I just always start with a row. And in here, my if statement is now testing if the value of the row and the column is the same as the distance in the column and the row. If it is not the same, it needs replacing. But we need to determine which one is the real value. And the question did tell us, if we quickly go back to the question, it told us there that the incorrect value is the integer and was rounded down. So we can assume that the incorrect value is smaller than the correct value. So once I find two that is not corresponding, I can test if the one, and I'm just using my first one that's dealing with the rows, is this one less than the other one, this one here that have the column first. If it is, it means this is the one that needs to be replaced by that one. So in this array here, I'm assigning this array, or in the if statement here, this array is assigned to this array there, because this would be greater, it's the real value, this is the integer value. Then we had to display in our rich edit, you would see, and those are important, if you see output and you see commas, or you see square brackets, anything strange, you need to add it to your output. So there's my brackets and my row, a comma, and then the column of the one I'm replacing. It must be of this one here that's on the left of the assignment statement. Then also indicating with which value. I'm replacing it with this value, my real value, stored in the column and row position there. If we have a look here at how marks were allocated, again for the two loops. So when you have two-dimensional arrays and you're unsure what to do, just throw two loops in there. Maybe you score a mark. Then to test that they are not the same, 1 mark. Test which one is correct. So in other words, test that the integer value is smaller than the real value, 1 mark. And then you need to replace. So this whole line of replacing, that's with 1 mark. To then display my row, that's 1 mark, and my column, sorry, together. Both of them together, 1 mark. To display the distance, again 1 mark. And then in general, just to display. So just to have your rich edit.lines.add, there you would get 1 mark as well, even if all of this is incorrect. So let that be a tip for you. When you know you can display something, just have your rich edit there with something that's displaying, because there might be a mark for just adding that code. Since I'm looping through the entire array, I can just work with one of the items here on the left to test if it's less than the other one, because eventually it will look at all of your items in your array to see which one is less than which. So let's say this was not true. Of course, when we get to this guy here, this will again be true, but then this would be on that side, this guy would be on that side, and therefore I don't need to have an else here. I can just test if the current one that I'm working with is less than this one. If it is, replace it. Else eventually it will get to the other one that I'm comparing it against. I just quickly ran my program. I know we didn't test the first one, but it's simply just display in my rich edit. Here you can still see that one is wrong because they are not the same. And then I click on validation, which shows me then those new distances. And if I now click on display chart, you will see that I'll see the new values there. There were no marks allocated for redisplaying your two-dimensional array as we did in this question. It would have been nice to just put this code that you have in the display chart inside of a procedure, and then you can just call it where you need it, but it wasn't a requirement to score the marks. Before we read the next question, I just want to show you guys visually what is going to happen. The user is going to select from a combo box CMB routes, something that looks like this, and this indicates the route that they want to take. In this example, they're starting at 4, which is Beacon, that's number 4, and they're traveling to 3, so 4 is Beacon, 3 is Cinsa, and then you need to get hold of that value there. Then from Cinsa, which is 3, they'll travel to 1, which is Morgan Bay, and that would be this value here. Then from Morgan Bay, which is 1, they are going to travel to 2, which is Haga Haga. So now we need to find Morgan Bay and Haga Haga, and you need to get hold of that value there. Then from Haga Haga, they will end then at 5, which is Ganubi. So Haga Haga to Ganubi, and you're going to get hold of that value there in the 2D array. So let's have a look at the question. Here is the next question, 4.3. It's asking us to use the input from the user from the combo box, and then they will select a possible route that could look like that. And then we need to determine the itinerary. So as I explained just now from the screenshot. And here they're just explaining that the extract the route, that just means store it and display the route in your rich edit. So there's already marks allocated for that, even though the rest of the question might be difficult for you to complete. Use the information in array names to display the name of each pair of checkpoints, because you're going from one point to the next, so you need to display both. And the array distances to display the distance between these checkpoints. That's you're going to read from your 2D array. Then they ask you, determine and display the approximate time in minutes it will take to complete the hike. Now you have to look at these sub-bullets here. It takes 20 minutes to walk a distance of 1 kilometer. So you have the distance there in kilometers. You can just multiply that by 20 to get the minutes. It takes double the time to walk the same distance in a rocky route, which would be between Haga Haga and Beacon Point. So that would be checkpoint 2 and 4, either row or column. Remember, the rows could be, the row and columns correspond. So 2 and 4 as rows and columns, or 4 and 2 as rows and columns. If the total time, the time you calculated up there, spent was more than 8 hours. Now remember, you're determining this in minutes. So you would have to quickly work out what is 8 hours. So remember, you do have your calculator there. We don't have to do maths here. We can use calculators. 8 hours, so that would be 8 times 60. That would be 480 minutes. So if the total time spent for one day is more than, not equal to, more than 8 hours. Oh, they gave us the 480 there. They were kind. The hiker must book accommodation to stay overnight at the last checkpoint for the day. The name or names of the overnight checkpoints must be displayed. There could be more than one within one route. Calculate and display the total distance of the hike in kilometers. So that's just the total distance that you had to determine from array distance that you got there. Press pause and I'll show you some example of output just now. Remember, you don't want to watch videos, you want to practice. So press pause or go back in this video and first try it yourself. Then test your program with this input to see if you get the right output. Don't just watch the memo next. Try and figure it out, and only when you're desperate, watch the memo. So here is 43125 that is displayed there. Beacon sensor, kilometers, minutes. Book at Haga Haga. So it must be this guy here. Then Haga Haga to Ganubi, and that was 12.86 kilometers. And then my total minutes here. And there's the total distance that is displayed. Then the next example of output, 24351. There's the route, and this one had more than one place to book at. So here we were at 192.6 minutes to go from Beacon to Cinsa, but combined with the previous one, it went over 8 hours, so we have to book at Cinsa. Then we book, we hike from Cinsa to Ganubi, and you can see that just that hike there is already over 480 minutes. So we need to book at Ganubi, and then we do our last stretch from Ganubi to Morgan Bay, and we display that, and then the total distance. Always important to look at what was provided so we don't have to code that and waste some time on something that won't score marks. And we need to get input from the user there from the combo box. We also had to display the route, so that is from the input. You'll see that I haven't used the .text. I want you guys to study this code because .text doesn't work for radio groups and list boxes. This code will work for all three of those objects, so it is important that you study .item, square brackets, same name of the object, .item index. Now, this here, as well as initializing your total, was worth 1 mark, the two of them together. We had to display the route. I added the empty line. There was no marks for it. However, we never know whether marks are allocated for something like an empty line or not. So rather just try to match the output exactly. The total minutes would also be important for you to initialize. Now I looped 4 times. You'll see that the input looks something like this. And you are allowed to do that as well. I just copied and pasted an example here for me so that I can see what I'm dealing with. This loops 4 times, and the reason why it's not looping 5 times is I'm working with pairs. So I'm hiking from here to there, 1. Here to there, 2. 3, 4. So I'm only hiking 4 times, even though, well, 4 from one place to another 4 times, even though there are 5 numbers. Every time I loop, I want to get hold of a pair from this to that. This I'm going to use as my row, and then the second one as my column. 1 loop, 1 mark there for looping the correct number of times. To get hold of the row, I'm just copying out the first character. So there I'm copying out the input from the user from the first character for 1 character. Why I did this, I don't know. Because you know what? It is much simpler when I look at this now to just go SIN 1. Anyway, copy is also good. Either way, you would score them 1 mark, but important is to change it to an integer because this is now your row index. Then I want to get hold of the second checkpoint. So the second checkpoint I have deleted, and there was 1 mark for deleting this. I've just deleted that. So once this code ran, if we copy and paste this over, oh wow, Haridas are back. That would get rid of this. So I'm now left with this. So now I can just copy out the first character again. Instead of copying, again, you could just use, instead of copying 1, you could just use that. It will produce the same output. And I now have my column index. So I've now copied out the 2 and the 1 for the first trip from one checkpoint to the next. Since I have the row and the column, I can just store the row and the column from array distance, which is the distance between these 2 checkpoints. I can store there in R distance. we were asked to determine the total distance in kilometers, and that is where I use R totals, R total plus R distance. Remember, R total is the one we initialized above the loop there. Then they said that 1 kilometer will take you 20 minutes. So I'm taking my distance that I calculated and multiplied that with 20. But this was for a normal route without any rocky terrain. The question then said if it was between the two checkpoints, I can't remember the names, it was 2 and 4. They said between Haga Haga and Beacon, there is a rocky route. It's going to take you double the time. So you want to check if the row is 2 and at the same time the column is 4, or if the row is 4 and the column is 2. There's many ways of doing this, but I've just found that the in operator would work the best and the quickest to code. So if this is true, then the minutes must be double the minutes. So I have, let's say, 30 minutes, and now I multiply it by 2, so now there's 60 minutes. We also had to determine the total number of minutes, and there I have my running total for the minutes. Our total minutes is total minutes plus the minutes that I've calculated either without the rocky route or with the rocky route. I'm using the same variable. We were then asked to display the name of the route. So that corresponds with your row or the checkpoint. So we're going from checkpoint 1, which is the row, and we're going to checkpoint I column, which is where we're going to. So I'm using array names, but making use of from I row to I column as I determined there at the top, from 2 to 1, and making use of my one-dimensional array. Then we also had to display the distance. So that distance there was important to keep as a separate variable. And then the minutes that it would take to go from one point to the next in there as well. Now comes the next part. And I'm still inside of that for loop that loops from 1 to 4. They said that if the minutes up to this point was greater than 480, important greater than, not greater or equal to, then we had to book, but we have to book at the second place. So if you have a look here, I'm going from Morgan Bay to Haga Haga. That means I have to book at Haga Haga. So this here on the left, what you see here is I row, and on the right is I col. So I have to book at I col, and that is what I'm displaying here. I want to book at, use your one-dimensional array at I col. When you look at the output, you will see there's an empty line there. This year there wasn't a mark allocated for that, but you never know. So I just added my empty line there to be safe. Now remember, once you've slept at this place, so this was your day trip, you're now going to book at Haga Haga, you're going to sleep, you're going to rest, and tomorrow you can do another 480 minutes. It is important to set your R total minutes back to 0 so you can start counting again. This all is where, this part here is where our for loop ends. On the outside, there was another empty line. So you can see there's an empty line. No mark this year for it. Next year, maybe there is. This year, there might be. We never know. But we had to display the total kilometers, the total distance here. Make sure that if you look at the output there, it was only displaying one decimal value, that you do the same. If you look at your output again, you'll see kilometers at the end. You do the same. Okay, make sure you do it correctly. So if we just go back to the top and see where marks are allocated, remember at the beginning I said the input and initializing, that was 1 mark. Then looping from 1 to 4, 1 mark. Then getting hold of your row, whichever way you used, as long as you got hold of the row, you got a mark. Deleting that first part, that part there, 1 mark. Getting hold of the column, 1 mark. Then determining your distance. Now let's say you struggled with this part. Make sure that you try it and then use your row and your column, because you know you're going to use array distance, which is your two-dimensional array. Make sure that you make use of these two variables in this line. Even though the row and column might be incorrect, you could still get this mark. And we store it there. Then we have our running total by adding our distance. This you should get right because we've done this since grade 10. And also determining the minutes. I mean, multiply by 20. Not easy. Also worth a mark. This whole if statement here was with 1 mark. And then multiplying your minutes by 2, you also get 1 mark there. Some of you guys might have put this, let's say you said this times by 40, else the distance times by 20. That's also correct. You will also get that mark. Then determining your running total of the minutes, 1 mark. When we get to the display, to display the correct names for the array names for the row and the column, that was 1 mark. And for displaying distance and time, that was worth 1 mark. Again, if you were struggling to determine the distance and the minutes, you can still display this and get the mark. We then had to determine our checkpoints or our sleepovers, and that if statement there was worth 1 mark. Booking at using iCall, the correct output there was 1 mark. And setting your minutes back to 0 was 1 mark. And then finally, the last mark there was to display our total, all with another mark. Here is an alternative solution to do the same thing. There are many alternatives to this question, but I declared a local array order, and then I looped through that string, the input string. And every time I looped, I delete 2 characters because remember, the string looks like this. So we have 1 comma, that's a full stop, 1 comma 2. So I'm getting hold of the first character and then I'm deleting that part. When it loops again, I'll get hold of the second one. And remember, there were 5 numbers. So now in array order, I have the correct values, the number, the indexes stored from 1 to 5. I just declared as a local variable here, but you can declare it as global as well. Remember, in question 4, you are allowed to declare your own arrays if you want to. This part here is the same. I'm now looping from 2 to 5, and you'll see why. When I'm determining the distance here for our distance, I need the row and the column. And I need to use the current row, so from this one to that one. Well, this one to that one or that one to this one, it doesn't actually matter which way you have it, but I'm using array order. So for example, 1, which would be k, and then 2, which would be, well, in this case, array order, the first one would be 1. So that would actually be this one here. Because we're going, if this was stored in array order 1, and this was array order 2, and I'm looping from 2, it means that this will be 2, and this will be 1, and these become my indexes for array distance. This part here is the same, testing for 2 and 5, so, but instead of then using row and columns, I'm using k and k minus 1. In my output here, I am using my array. So my array order is really storing the indexes of the array. I am using array order and I'm using k minus 1. That's the first one, going to the second one. When I want to book, I'm booking at the second one. That would be k. And the rest really looks the same. So I've just replaced that with a one-dimensional array that could also work. I got a nice red line because I forgot to remove my comments, but I'm going to put them back so we can just see one solution, else we'll see many. Here is one of the examples of output, the one that is 24351. And here you should see two bookings. So Sinsa, that was my first one. And the next booking is Ganubi. And then our last stretch is from Ganubi to Morgan Bay. And there's my total distance. The next one here was 43125. This was actually first example of output. And here you should see Ganubi as your last destination. And here we would book only at Haga Haga. There wasn't a second one. And your total distance there must be 38.3 kilometers. And just check your distances and minutes here at the top. If those are wrong, then obviously your booking would be wrong as well. So it does help to look at all the other output to correct your errors during an exam. Thank you, grade 12s, for watching Dandelion Delphi tutorials. I hope you found this useful. For more information about two-dimensional arrays, please go to book 3 and keep coding. Hope to see you soon.